Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. I regard Middlebury and Belfer as siblings, and it's always nice to see family. So I'm going to talk today about the descent from the nuclear security summits. And as we descend, it's my view that we will need to focus on a peril that requires vigilance to understand it and action to avoid it. I'd point out that since the summit is used as a metaphor, there are far more people who were killed on the descent from Everest than are killed during the climb to the top. And I think probably the analogy is apt with respect to nuclear security. So I'll talk about the motivations, strengths, and weaknesses of the nuclear security summits, some of the innovations that came out of them, what remains to be done, and how we might contemplate doing it. And then Bill asked me to have a word on the U.S.-Russian relationship with respect to nuclear security. And I was in Moscow with Senator Nunn and others last February, and we discussed nuclear security among several topics. So I think with respect to the nuclear security summits, it's important to understand that the context. And each president since George H.W. Bush has made nuclear security and combating the threat of nuclear terrorism a priority. And each has pursued this in his own way. So President Bush 41 signed the Nunn-Lugar legislation. Senators Nunn and Lugar are rightfully given credit for it, but it was a partnership with the administration, and it took some creativity and a little bit of risk-taking, not only on the Russian-Soviet side, but also on the U.S. side, because during those days it wasn't exactly clear where the Soviet Union and then Russia were headed. President Clinton has effectively defined the nuclear security agenda. All of the programs that were pursued subsequently had their origins during his administration. So he effectively set the agenda. After September 11th, particularly, President George W. Bush doubled the budgets for most of those programs, certainly doubled the total budget, and expanded the scope and increased the pace of nuclear security cooperation work within Russia under the Bratislava Initiative. And then finally, President Obama outlined the Nuclear Security Summit agenda, which was somewhat transformational in terms of the earlier approaches. But it is important to understand that this is part of a legacy of bipartisan cooperation in both the executive and the legislative branches. The concern about nuclear terrorism, though, actually dates from the morning of the atomic age, perhaps not the dawn, but the morning of the atomic age. It was initially seen as a Soviet-centered threat, the idea that the Soviet Union might either unleash Spetsnaz forces into the United States to conduct nuclear detonations, or perhaps might provide proxy terrorist groups. There was later concern that terrorist groups might actually gain a nuclear weapons capability themselves, especially during the 70s and 80s, when there was a wave of kidnappings, assassinations, and aircraft hijackings that beset North America and Europe. That culminated in 1986 in a national intelligence estimate on nuclear terrorism. So far as I know, that was the first national intelligence estimate on nuclear terrorism. The intelligence community had published other notes that were less formal. About 90% of it has been declassified, and it had, in my view, two important conclusions. It found first that a sophisticated terrorist group, if it gained access to sufficient fissile material or an actual nuclear weapon, could probably cause a detonation. So for those that wondered, whether men in caves can do this, it said, yep, a sophisticated group can do it. But it also importantly found that the terrorist groups that were then known, remember this was 1986, would not be likely to do so because it would defeat their political objectives. These were groups for whom the political backlash to a nuclear detonation would be so great that it would essentially self-deter them. I would argue that all that changed with the rise of Al-Qaeda and ISIS behind it. Arguably, it changed first under Shinrikyo, which had apocalyptic visions, and perhaps Chechen terrorists who are known to have at least reconnoitered Russian nuclear facilities. So with that background, let's talk a little bit about the summits. A theorist of summits, and I hadn't realized until recently, and I should say also that my talk is largely based on a paper that's about to be published that was commissioned by the Stanley Foundation. And so it was a look both at summitry and nuclear security. So there are theorists of summitry. David Reynolds said, "Summitry is made possible by air travel. It is made necessary by weapons of mass destruction." So there, I think you have, in one neat phrase, the motivation behind the nuclear security summits. But I would argue that it was not a foregone conclusion that a president would turn to summitry. And there are actually some very good reasons why nuclear security would not be taken up at the summit level. At Yalta, at the Yalta summit with FDR and Stalin and others, the British Foreign Secretary Alexander Cadogan said, "It's always the same with these conferences. They take days to get on the rails. The great men don't know what they're talking about and have to be educated and a bit more tidy in their methods." There was frustration even then with men as capable as Roosevelt and Churchill. That, of course, I would argue applies to some extent to nuclear security, which is an arcane technical topic where the important decisions are almost always made at a level below the head of state, head of government level. So why meet at the summit? Other disadvantages: the summit was very large. The first one had 47 nations and 38 heads of state or heads of government. If those representatives spoke for even 10 minutes apiece, which is a relatively short speech for a head of state or a government, it would take more than 8 hours. And you can be sure that no other head of state or head of government wants to sit through 8 hours of speeches by somebody else. They were also both regular and finite, which was different from the pattern of other established summits. So, for example, we have NATO summits, which meet regularly to discuss questions related to NATO security. There's an ongoing commitment to that issue. And there's a feeling of responsibility and, to some extent, some camaraderie. You want to get along with your colleagues there because you know you're going to have to meet with them again pretty soon. Wasn't the case with each nuclear security summit because they were taken kind of one at a time. We didn't know whether there'd be a next one until one concluded, and then finally now they're over. They also didn't have that same finite urgency that applies to other summits that are single issue summits, where there's one problem that's urgent and needs to get solved, they'll solve it and then move on. So it had kind of the worst of all worlds in being both regular and finite. Finally, it was also a very narrow agenda for heads of state and heads of government. The G20 agenda is quite broad in relation to that. The NATO agenda, while more narrow, is at least comprehensive within the security of Europe. You don't necessarily see that in the nuclear security realm. So why then did the president turn to the summit as a solution? I think there were 6 reasons. First, it capitalized on his enormous personal popularity. He knew he could get people to come. Confidence in American world leadership when he took office was very high, according to polls. And as a consequence, politicians wanted to be seen with him. They wanted to have their picture taken with him. So he knew he could get them there. So he was trading on his unique asset there. Second, they could yield quick results, especially with the structure that I'll talk about in terms of national commitments and multilateral commitments. Quick results relative to treaties or even standards like Information Circular 225 under the International Atomic Energy Agency. Third, they could be used to cut through red tape. We saw that over and over again, that projects that had been sort of in the queue for years were advanced because finally a leader had a look at them. Fourth, it caused high-level attention to this issue, and I think the administration wanted that to happen. You can imagine a leader in preparing for the summit talking to his staff, talking to his cabinet ministers and their underlings and saying, you know, I'm headed off to Washington on this nuclear security thing, and I don't necessarily know a lot about what you do, but you better not embarrass me with a nuclear security incident. Get this right. And that alone infuses the bureaucracies with a sense of urgency and is important. And then finally, penultimately, and related to the other one, is the notion of infusing leaders with an undelegatable responsibility. If you talk to CEOs in the nuclear realm, people who run nuclear utilities, they believe that security and safety are both undelegatable responsibilities of the chief executive officer. He or she may have a safety or security manager, but he can't say, well, we had this enormous problem and it was his or her fault. It was my fault. That notion applied at the head of state, head of government level was an important one. Now, I would say that it was only achieved in a partial fashion. I'll talk more about that later. And then finally, the administration talked about the importance of the summits in empowering, elevating, and energizing the international organizations that have responsibility for nuclear security, ranging from the International Atomic Energy Agency with primacy, to the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, to the World Institute for Nuclear Security. There were several innovations at these summits, maybe not completely new, but new enough that we can think of them in terms of how they might be applied in future cases. First was this notion that I mentioned of what were called colloquially house gifts or gift baskets. Nations were encouraged to show up with tangible progress on the nuclear security front, new regulations, removal of materials, conversions of reactors, etc. And in the first summit, and then in subsequent summits, they were encouraged not only to do that individually, but to act collectively. And those did yield tangible results. And I would also note that this was possible because the incentives with respect to nuclear security are different from important other realms like arms control or controlling carbon emissions. In those cases, there are fairly significant penalties, either in terms of security or economics, for being a first or sole mover. If you go first or alone on arms control, you will very likely, not always, but very likely feel that you've disadvantaged yourself relative to other states. Same with carbon emissions. You're going to incur economic costs that other states might not, and you may become or feel you'll become less competitive. With respect to nuclear security, while the advantages may not be as great from sole or first movement, there are fewer relative downsides. Obviously, collective action is most effective, but you will have at least incrementally improved your own security, and the downsides you face are relatively limited. And that made, in my view, the house gifts and gift baskets more possible. Another important outcome of the summit was a web of connections, both within governments and between governments. And the Sherpas meeting regularly forced interagency coordination within governments and then set up connections between people that are ongoing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. There were tangible results from the summits. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Just to highlight them as a base of discussion. There were more than 40 countries engaged in capacity building in terms of centers of excellence or training. More than 30 countries enacted new national laws or regulation. More than 20 countries had either peer or IAEA reviews of their security. 38 states pledged to pursue excellence in nuclear security implementation and specified the steps that they would take. 17 countries removed fissile material and 13 rid themselves entirely of fissile material. So there were real, tangible accomplishments from the summit. There were, however, some gaps that remain. The first I would identify is no specific legally binding standards on nuclear security. And as you all, I'm sure, are well aware, while there are standards, they aren't necessarily specific or legally binding. So Information Circular 225, published by the IAEA, is not legally binding, and it is sufficiently vague that it does not necessarily require, for example, armed guards at all facilities that have weapons usable material. The Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material is legally binding, but it basically tells states that they have to have standards, but doesn't say what those standards are. Again, you have the same problem with respect to armed guards, as just one example. Second, Russia's absence was a severe blow. Russia didn't attend the final nuclear security summit, with more than half of the world's fissile material and more than half of the world's weapons. Its exclusion is obviously crippling to a solution to the problem overall. Third, complacency, in my view, is the biggest threat to excellence in nuclear security, and we saw that cropping up. I'll quote a Russian foreign ministry official, but it I think reflected a somewhat widespread viewpoint. Quote, "The political agenda of these meetings has been exhausted." In other words, we've done what we needed to do. There's really nothing more to be done. Russia chose not to show up. Others simply said, well, this would be the last summit. And you see that, unfortunately, reflected in even the US non-proliferation budget. So the budget for international assistance on nuclear security has now fallen for the past 6 years. The 2017 request is below, the 2017 Obama request for nuclear security assistance is below the 2009 Bush administration request for nuclear security assistance. So we've gone backwards. And then fourth, military material remains a subject that probably hasn't been sufficiently grappled with. As again, I'm sure you're all familiar, roughly 83% of the HEU and plutonium in the world is held in military stocks. The IAEA, by definition, doesn't deal with that. The same with the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. Even the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, one of its founding documents, excludes military material. Now, one can hope that the lessons that are learned in the civil realm are applied to the military realm, because obviously the military stocks are at least as dangerous as some of the civil ones, but that can't be said for sure. So where do we go from here? Well, the summit had a couple of answers with respect to that. First of all, there were 5 action plans that were developed for the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Interpol, the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, and the Global Partnership that was established under the first G8, now G7 process. I think that's all good, and these are important organizations, and they do extremely useful work. I would note that the Russians specifically called out these work programs as being illegitimate because they came from the Nuclear Security Summit. Now, whether or not they will actually resist within each organization, and I don't think the summits pretended to be able to instruct these organizations. They simply said that summit participants in their pursuit of work under these organizations would also pursue these work programs. Whether Russia will obstruct those work programs, I guess, remains to be seen, but it's not a good sign to begin with. And then second, the summit established a contact group. In other words, the Sherpas will continue to meet, summits without leaders, sort of. And those people, often at the undersecretary level, sometimes a little bit more junior, do have the ability to marshal the resources within their governments. So if they stick to it, and if they really do try and oversee this agenda, I think that's a promising venue for carrying on the conversation. I would make 5 further recommendations in addition to where the summit is headed. First, I think that the P3, the permanent 3, US, UK, France, and then the permanent 5, including Russia and China, should develop and share an empirically based standards of nuclear security excellence. I think that can start in the first instance with the United States and Russia. The United States and Russia have a long history of discussing what's necessary for an excellent nuclear security plan. They did it over and over again in Russia. And so it can be done without reference to theory. It can be done empirically. Here's what we did. And I think it can be held in terms that are sufficiently vague as not to threaten Russian nuclear security. Obviously, you don't want to be so specific that you would reveal secrets that are sensitive, but I think the general principles can be developed. And that these then could be shared beyond the P5 with other states that have either nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons usable material. Second, and you've heard this theme before, but I believe that we need to get the US-Russian cooperation back on track. One vehicle for that might be the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, which was founded by the United States and Russia in 2006. It's still co-chaired by them. I think that agenda needs to be reinvigorated. And one example of that would be there isn't a nuclear security working group within that, which is an anomaly that I don't quite understand. There are several other working groups and they regularly hold exercises, but a nuclear security working group would be, I think, a useful start. Third, the next administration will need to pick up the reins on this issue. This is not an issue that has been solved. And as soon as we are convinced that it's solved, we're likely to have a security incident. If you look at the serious security incidents that have occurred over the last 10 years or so, Y-12, Pelindaba, the Brussels incidents, I think you see complacency as a recurring theme in each of those cases. And so complacency must be fought. Just one example, it wasn't until after the Paris attacks that Belgium decided to put armed guards at its facilities with weapons usable fissile material. And I don't believe that those guards were necessarily in place when the Brussels attacks occurred. And we know, for example, that they'd been surveilling an executive at a facility that contained weapons usable material. But, and I don't mean to pick on the Belgians. Obviously, the United States, with the Y-12 example, one of the investigators said they tolerated the intolerable in terms of false alarms. And the guards obviously allowed the nun and her colleagues to be present for a couple of hours because they were simply tired of answering false alarms. Complacency. Fourth, world leaders really do need to accept as an undelegatable responsibility the need for nuclear security, the security of fissile material within their borders. And I would hope that while I understand summit fatigue, and I think there's a good argument to be made in favor of not continuing the nuclear security summits, if they could continue every 4 or 5 years, perhaps associated with G20 summits, it would be useful in reinforcing this principle of their leadership, of the leadership's responsibility on this issue. And it would also allow for a review of the agenda and progress and gaps for the 5 plans that were laid out at the final nuclear security summit. And then fifth, the contact group needs to remain energetic. I think it's a good development that they established that, but it will be important for the actual players within that group to be vigorous in pursuing an agenda and rigorously looking at where they've made progress and where they still have gaps. And those are my recommendations.
The U.S.-Russian thing you were going to say?
Oh, yes. So, well, I've dealt with it to a certain extent. I don't think that the nuclear security agenda can be dealt with effectively if Russia is excluded. The parlous state of U.S.-Russian relations, I think, has unfortunately effectively ended nuclear security cooperation within Russia. There's still some cooperation outside of Russia, but even that is inhibited. The group that I was with in Moscow under Senator Nunn's leadership dealt with several aspects of the nuclear agenda with Russia. Right now, Russia, I think, is working to effectively evade a U.S. boycott, blockade, diminution of cooperation. So they're open to cooperation. Now, I think that has political motivations behind it as much as the substantive ones, but it could be useful. Their price, however, of course, is, well, the United States wants to talk about nuclear security. We want to talk about the whole range of nuclear issues, including commercial cooperation. And I think that it is an issue of such overriding, such surpassing importance that we should at least be willing to talk to the whole range of discussions. Now, what we actually agree in the other realms, I think, depends on what the Russians propose and whether it's consistent with U.S. interests. But for my purposes anyway, I would say that we should be willing to talk to the Russians about the whole range